Terry Williams had been called to fix a lot of broken windows in his 12 years as a handyman, but he could tell within seconds of pulling into the circular driveway that Joanne Moreau's shattered glass was the least of her problems. And this repair job was about to get a whole lot more complicated than replacing a few panes, especially when the woman who answered the door in a silk dress that clung to every dangerous curve looked like she'd been holding herself together with the same fragile precision as the spider-webbed window behind her. The house screamed money, manicured edges, imported stone facade, the kind of architectural perfection that belonged in magazine spreads. But Terry's trained eye went straight to the details that didn't fit. Newspapers piling up on the porch, dead flowers in expensive planters, and security cameras that seemed focused more on keeping someone in than keeping others out. Joanne opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been watching for his truck. She was stunning in that polished way wealthy women perfected. Blonde hair swept into a flawless chignon, cream-colored dress that probably cost more than his monthly rent. But her green eyes were rimmed with exhaustion that no concealer could hide. "You must be from Henderson Glass," she said, voice pitched too high, too bright. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Terry hefted his tool bag, studying the woman who was trying so hard to appear in control. 20 years of working in upscale neighborhoods had taught him to read the signs. The way she gripped the doorframe, the slight tremor in her manicured hands. "Ma'am, I'm Terry Williams, independent contractor." He kept his voice gentle, professional. "Your message said something about a broken window?" "Yes, the living room." She stepped aside reluctantly, gesturing toward a room where afternoon sunlight streamed through a spider web of cracks in what had once been a pristine bay window. It was an accident." Terry walked to the damaged glass, running his fingers along the impact pattern. The break radiated from a central point about shoulder height, the kind of damage that came from something heavy hitting it hard. Something thrown from inside. "This happened recently?" he asked, though the answer was obvious from the way she flinched. "This morning." Joanne's voice caught slightly. "I was rearranging furniture. A lamp fell." Terry nodded, though they both knew lamps didn't create impact patterns like this. He'd seen enough domestic calls to recognize the signs, but something about Joanne's carefully constructed composure told him this conversation would require more than his usual diplomatic silence. "I can have this fixed by tomorrow evening," he said quietly. "But ma'am, whatever threw this lamp, that's the real problem that needs addressing." Their eyes met across the broken glass, and Terry saw exactly how deep the damage went. The living room felt like a museum exhibit. Everything positioned with calculated precision, not a pillow out of place, not a surface that showed evidence of actual living. Terry moved carefully through the space, hyper-aware of how his work boots sounded against the pristine hardwood, while Joanne hovered nearby like a nervous curator, afraid he might disturb something sacred. "Beautiful home," he said, pulling out his measuring tape. The compliment was automatic, professional, but as he looked closer, the perfection felt suffocating. Fresh flowers arranged too precisely, magazines fanned at exact angles, not a single family photo visible anywhere. "Thank you." Joanne's voice carried that same brittle brightness. "We just had the decorator finish last month." Terry knelt beside the broken window, running his hands along the frame. The glass would need complete replacement. But that wasn't what made him pause. There were other marks, small scratches in the expensive trim, a barely visible dent in the drywall nearby, signs of previous impacts that had been carefully repaired and painted over. "You'll want to check the frame for structural damage," Joanne said quickly, as if reading his thoughts. "I know it looks worse than it is." Terry glanced up at her. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, that cream-colored dress suddenly looking more like armor than elegance. Her makeup was flawless, but he could see the faint shadow of what might have been a bruise along her jawline. expertly concealed, with foundation. "Mrs. Moreau," he said carefully, "how long have you lived here?" 3 years. The answer came too fast, rehearsed. "My husband and I bought it right after we married." Terry nodded, making notes on his pad while his mind catalogued other details. The way she positioned herself always within reach of an exit, how she startled when a car door slammed outside, the expensive security system that seemed designed more for keeping someone trapped than keeping intruders out. "This kind of glass," he said, tapping the remaining shards, "it's tempered safety glass. Takes considerable force to break it like this." Their eyes met across the damaged window, and, for a moment, Joanne's careful composure flickered. Terry saw raw fear flash across her features before she rebuilt her walls. "Accidents happen," she said quietly. Terry had worked enough houses to know the difference between accidents and intent. But something in Joanne's desperate composure told him she wasn't ready to hear that truth spoken aloud. "Not yet. I'll need to order special glass," he said instead. "Might take a day or two to get the right specifications." Relief flooded her face so completely that Terry realized she'd been holding her breath. "That's fine," Joanne whispered. "Take all the time you need." But they both knew time wasn't going to fix what was really broken in this perfect house. Terry was measuring the window frame for the second time when Joanne's phone rang, the sound sharp and intrusive in the carefully maintained silence. She glanced at the screen and her entire body went rigid, the color draining from her face so quickly that Terry thought she might faint. "I have to take this," she whispered, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The phone rang again. Terry watched, her hands shake as she finally answered. "Hello, Richard." Her voice transformed completely, smaller, more careful, like she was walking across thin ice. "No, I'm still at home. I told you I had a headache." Terry focused on his measuring tape, trying to give her privacy in the same room. But the kitchen was open to the living room and sound carried whether he wanted it to or not. The window. Joanne's laugh was hollow, practiced. "I already called someone. It's being handled." A pause, then quickly. No, you don't need to come home early. I have everything under control." Terry's hands stilled on his tools. The voice on the other end was getting louder, though he couldn't make out words. But he could hear the tone, sharp, demanding, the kind of voice that expected immediate compliance. "Richard, please," Joanne said, and the desperation bleeding through her controlled tone made Terry's jaw clench. "It was an accident. I was moving the lamp table, and it fell into the—" The voice cut her off, harsh enough that Terry could hear it across the room. Joanne's free hand pressed against her mouth, as if physically holding back words that wanted to escape. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I understand. I'll be more careful." She ended the call with shaking fingers, staring at the phone like it might bite her. For a long moment, the house was completely silent, except for the tick of an expensive grandfather. "Glock." Terry straightened slowly, setting down his measuring tape. "Mrs. Moreau." She startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there. When she looked at him, her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the tears threatening to spill. "That lamp table," Terry said quietly. "How exactly did it fall into the window?" Joanne's breath caught. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen island, then back to him, and he saw the exact moment she realized what she'd revealed. The lie about rearranging furniture, the story about accidents, all of it crumbling under the weight of a phone call she hadn't meant for him to hear. She started, then stopped. Terry took a careful step closer. "Mrs. Moreau, that window wasn't broken from the inside, was it?" The question hung between them like a held breath, and Terry watched 20 years of survival instincts war with 3 minutes of desperate hope in her green eyes. "If you don't mind," Terry said gently, "I'd like to check the other windows. Sometimes impact damage can affect the surrounding frames." Joanne nodded wordlessly, leading him through the house like a ghost touring her own haunting. The formal dining room revealed more careful repairs. Fresh paint over what looked like fist-sized holes in the drywall, a replaced section of crown molding that didn't quite match the original. "This room gets good light," Terry observed, running, his fingers along a windowsill that showed stress fractures. "Must be nice for entertaining." "We don't entertain much anymore." Joanne's voice was barely above a whisper. "Richard prefers quiet evenings at home." Terry nodded, making notes he didn't need while cataloguing damage that had nothing to do with windows. In the hallway, he spotted a family photo that looked recent. Joanne, radiant in a blue dress, standing beside a man with cold eyes and a possessive arm around her waist. Even in the photo, she looked diminished next to him. "How long have you been married?" Terry asked, though he already suspected the answer would align with the timeline of repairs. 3 years this fall." Joanne wrapped her arms around herself. "Everything was perfect at first. Richard can be very charming when he wants to be." They moved to the master bedroom, where Terry noticed the lock on the bathroom door had been recently replaced, installed from the outside. Fresh spackle around the frame suggested it hadn't been a voluntary upgrade. "Mrs. Moreau," Terry said, "carefully. These repairs you've been doing, you handle them all yourself. Richard travels for work. A lot." She sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed, looking lost in the expanse of cream-colored luxury. "He says it's easier if I just take care of things while he's gone." Terry knelt beside a baseboard that showed water damage, the kind that came from cleaning up spills repeatedly, urgently. "What kind of work does your husband do?" "Sales, medical equipment." Joanne's fingers twisted her wedding ring. "He's very successful, very particular about how things should be." The way she said particular made Terry's chest tighten with recognition. He'd grown up with a father who was particular about how his mother kept house, how she spoke to neighbors, how she existed in the world. "Success doesn't give a man the right to control everything," Terry said quietly. Joanne's head snapped up, green eyes wide with something between hope and terror. "I never said you didn't have to." Terry stood slowly, his voice gentle, but certain. "Walls tell stories, Mrs. Moreau, and yours are telling me you're living in a house that's not safe." For the first time since he'd arrived, Joanne met his eyes directly. "What am I supposed to do about that?" The question hung between them, raw and desperate, the first completely honest thing she'd said all day. Terry was packing his tools when Joanne's phone rang again. This time relief flooded her features when she saw the caller ID. "Victoria," she answered, her voice brightening for the first time all day. "I was just thinking about calling you." Terry continued organizing his equipment, but Joanne made no move to leave the room. Maybe she needed the comfort of another voice, even with a stranger listening. "No, everything's fine," Joanne said, though her eyes found Terry's across the room. "Just having some work done on the house. A window got broken." The voice on the other end sharpened with interest. Terry could hear it from across the room, the kind of tone that demanded details. "It was an accident, Victoria. I already told you I'm clumsy lately." Joanne's fingers worried the hem of her dress. "No, Richard doesn't know yet. He's in Chicago until Thursday." Victoria's response was rapid-fire, authoritative. Joanne's shoulders tensed with each word. "I know you mean well," Joanne said carefully. "But marriage isn't always perfect. People have to work through things." Terry paused in his packing. The conversation felt familiar. The same careful deflection he'd heard from his own mother when neighbors asked about bruises, about why she jumped at unexpected sounds. "Victoria, please." Joanne's voice carried a note of desperation. "I can't just leave. Richard provides everything. This house, my car, my credit cards. What would I do? Where would I go?" The sister's voice rose, exasperated. Terry caught fragments. "Making excuses? Family reputation. Divorce would destroy Dad's business connections." Joanne moved to the window, staring out at the manicured lawn. You don't understand what it's like. Richard can be wonderful when he's happy. It's only when he's stressed, when work gets difficult. Terry had heard enough. He cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Moreau, I'll need to come back tomorrow with the new glass. What time works for you? Joanne turned, gratitude flickering in her eyes for the interruption. Victoria, I have to go. The contractor needs to finish up. She listened for a moment, then said firmly, No, you don't need to come over. I'm handling it. She ended the call and stood in the sudden silence, looking smaller than ever. Family can be complicated, Terry said quietly. My sister thinks I'm being dramatic. Joanne's laugh was bitter. She says I should be grateful for what I have, that marriage requires compromise. Terry shouldered his tool bag. There's a difference between compromise and surrender, Mrs. Moreau. The words hit their mark. Joanne's hand pressed against her throat and Terry saw her fighting tears. What if she's right? Joanne whispered. What if this is just what marriage is? Terry met her eyes steadily. Then why did you call me to fix the window instead of him? Terry's phone buzzed at 11:43 p.m., dragging him from the edge of sleep. The number wasn't saved in his contacts, but he recognized it from the work order he'd filed that afternoon. He stared at the screen for 3 rings, thumb hovering over the decline button. Professional boundaries. That's what his mentor had always preached. Fix the problem, collect the check, go home. But something about Joanne's desperate question from earlier wouldn't let him rest. Terry speaking. Terry? Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with tears and something that might have been terror. I'm sorry to call so late, but I didn't know who else. Richard came home early, and he saw the broken window, and I told him about you coming over, and he... Slow down, Terry said, already sitting up, feet hitting the cold hardwood of his studio apartment. Where are you now? Locked in the bathroom. He's downstairs, but he's been drinking and he's so angry about the expense and the fact that I hired someone without asking and... Her voice broke completely. Terry, I'm scared. Terry was already pulling on jeans, phone pressed between his shoulder and ear. 20 years of emergency calls had taught him to read the difference between inconvenience and crisis. This was crisis. Is he threatening you? A pause. Then so quietly he almost missed it. He doesn't have to. The admission hit Terry like a physical blow. Joanne, listen to me. I'm coming over. No, you can't. If he sees your truck, I'll park down the street. Terry grabbed his keys, wallet, the flashlight from his kitchen counter. Is there a way for you to get to the front door without him seeing? Maybe. He's in the kitchen. And if I go down the back stairs, don't take any risks. If you can't get to the door safely, stay where you are. I'll figure something else out. Terry. Her voice cracked on his name. Why are you doing this? The question stopped him halfway to his truck. Why was he breaking every professional rule he'd built his business on? Why was he driving across town at midnight for a woman he'd met 2 days ago? Because you called, he said simply. The drive through empty suburban streets felt endless. Terry had responded to plenty of emergency calls, but nothing that made his chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to protective fury. When he pulled into Joanne's neighborhood, every house was dark except one, hers, where lights blazed in the kitchen windows like a beacon of distress. He parked 3 houses down and texted her. I'm here. His phone buzzed immediately. Back door. Please hurry. Terry grabbed his tool bag, old habit, and headed toward whatever was waiting for him in that perfect house. 3 days later, Joanne met Terry at Morrison's Hardware looking like a woman on a mission. She'd traded her designer clothes for jeans and sneakers, her perfectly styled hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The bruise on her wrist was fading, but still visible, a reminder of why she was here. I want to learn, she announced as they walked through the aisles of tools and supplies. Everything. How to fix things myself. Terry studied her face, looking for signs of second thoughts. This isn't about windows anymore, is it? No. Her voice was steady, determined. It's about not being helpless. They started small. Terry showed her how to hold a screwdriver properly, how to read the grain of wood, how to measure twice and cut once. Joanne's hands, soft from years of manicures and moisturizer, fumbled with the unfamiliar tools at first. "I feel so stupid," she muttered, after dropping a screw for the third time. "First time I tried to install a cabinet, I put it in upside down," Terry said, guiding her hands to the correct position. "Took me 4 hours to figure out why the doors wouldn't close." At his workshop, a converted garage behind his duplex, Joanne attacked every lesson with fierce concentration. She learned to sand with the grain, to recognize the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead by touch alone, to trust her own measurements instead of asking for confirmation. "Feel that?" Terry asked, placing her hand on a piece of lumber. "That's how you know the wood is ready for stain." Joanne nodded, running her fingers across the smooth surface. For the first time in years, she was learning something Richard couldn't control, couldn't critique, couldn't take away from her. "My sister thinks I'm having a breakdown," she said, carefully applying wood stain with a brush Terry had taught her to load properly. "She says normal women don't suddenly decide to learn carpentry." Terry looked up from the cabinet door he was sanding. "What do you think?" "I think normal women don't live in houses where they're afraid to move wrong." Joanne's brush moved in steady, even strokes. "I think this is the first time in 3 years I've felt like I might be capable of something." The admission hung between them in the dusty air of the workshop. Terry watched her work, the fierce concentration, the growing confidence in her movements, the way she no longer asked permission before reaching for a tool. "Joanne," he said quietly, "what happens when Richard finds out about this?" Her hand stilled on the brush. When she looked at him, Terry saw something new in her green eyes. Not fear, but resolve. "Then I guess I'll need to know how to fix whatever he breaks." Terry was installing the new window when he heard the garage door rumble open 2 hours earlier than expected. Through the glass, he watched Joanne's face drain of color as she checked her phone. "He's not supposed to be home until 6, she whispered, and panic creeping into her voice. "It's okay," Terry said, but his hands were already moving to pack his tools. "I'll finish this tomorrow." The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the new window in its frame. Heavy footsteps crossed the marble foyer, each one deliberate, territorial. Terry had heard that walk before, a man marking his territory, announcing his presence like a warning. "Joanne!" Richard's voice carried the particular edge of controlled fury. "Where are you?" Terry watched Joanne transform in real time, shoulders curving inward, chin dropping, the confidence she'd been building over the past week disappearing like smoke. She smoothed her hair, checked her reflection in the window, preparing to become invisible. "In here," she called out, voice carefully modulated to convey nothing threatening. Richard appeared in the doorway, and Terry understood immediately why Joanne had learned to make herself small. The man was tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of cold charisma that could charm a room or terrorize it, depending on his mood. When his eyes landed on Terry, something predatory flickered across his features. "And you are?" "Terry Williams, finishing up the window repair." Richard's gaze swept over Terry's tools, his work clothes, the easy way he stood in what Richard clearly considered his domain. "I thought this was supposed to be done yesterday." "Richard?" Joanne's voice was barely above a whisper. "Terry had to order special glass." "I told you that, did you?" Richard's attention shifted to his wife, and Terry saw Joanne flinch almost imperceptibly. "I don't recall that conversation." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Terry had grown up around men like Richard, men who used silence like a weapon, who could make their displeasure felt without raising their voice. "I should get going," Terry said, but Richard stepped closer to Joanne, effectively blocking the path to the door. "Actually," Richard said, his hand settling on Joanne's shoulder with possessive weight, "I'd like to discuss the billing. It seems my wife has been quite generous with my money." Terry saw Joanne's jaw tighten, saw her hands curl into fists at her sides. 3 weeks ago, she would have apologized, deflected, made herself smaller. But something had changed. "I can afford to fix my own window," Joanne said quietly. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Richard's grip on her shoulder tightened, and Terry took a step forward before he could stop himself. "Problem here?" Terry asked, his voice carrying 20 years of construction sites and men who thought intimidation was a conversation starter. The Moreau family dinner table felt like a tribunal. Joanne sat between her mother and Victoria in the formal dining room of her childhood home, surrounded by the scent of pot roast and the weight of accumulated disappointment. Her father presided from the head of the table, silent but watchful, while her mother served judgment alongside the roasted vegetables. "Dr. Patterson's wife saw you at Morrison's Hardware last week," her mother announced, spooning potatoes onto Joanne's plate like she was still 12. "With some man, a working man. His name is Terry," Joanne said quietly. "He's been helping me with repairs." Victoria leaned forward, perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table. "Joanne, we need to talk about what's really happening here. Moving out of Richard's house, refusing his calls, spending time with someone who treats me like a human being." The words slipped out before Joanne could stop them. The silence was deafening. Her mother's fork clinked. Against her plate, the sound sharp as glass breaking. "Richard Moreau is a successful man from a good family." Her father spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "He's given you everything: position, security, respect in this community. He's given me bruises and panic attacks," Joanne replied, surprising herself with her steadiness. Victoria's eyes flashed with something that might have been embarrassment. "Don't be dramatic. Every marriage has its challenges. You can't just run away because things get difficult." "I'm not running away. I'm running towards something." Joanne pushed her plate away, appetite gone. "Terry doesn't make me afraid to speak. He doesn't monitor my phone calls or tell me I'm too stupid to handle money. He teaches me things instead of keeping me ignorant." Her mother's face flushed red. "You think you're better than us now? Think this contractor is going to give you what Richard can?" "He already has," Joanne said firmly. "He's given me back myself." Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against hardwood. "This is insane. You're throwing away everything for some—" She stopped herself, but the unfinished words hung in the air. "Say it," Joanne challenged, standing to meet her sister's gaze. "Say what you really think about Terry." "He's not our kind of people," her mother said coldly, "and you're forgetting where you come from." Joanne looked around the dining room where she'd learned to be seen and not heard, to agree and not question, to make herself smaller, to fit into other people's expectations. "No," she said quietly. "I'm finally remembering who I was before I learned to be afraid." She grabbed her purse, keys already in hand. At the door, she turned back to find 3 faces staring at her, disappointed, worried, angry. "The divorce papers will be filed Monday," she announced, "and Terry will be there when I sign them." 3 weeks after the divorce papers were filed, Joanne's house finally looked like a home instead of a museum. Terry found her in the kitchen at sunrise, measuring cabinet spaces for the breakfast bar they'd designed together, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing jeans stained with primer and determination. "You're early," he said, accepting the coffee she offered. "Couldn't sleep, too excited to see how the countertop looks with the new backsplash." She gestured toward the wall where they'd spent yesterday installing subway tiles, her movements confident now, no longer seeking permission before reaching for tools. They worked in comfortable rhythm, Joanne holding boards steady while Terry, passing him the right drill bit before he asked, reading measurements from blueprints they'd drawn together. Her hands, once soft and pampered, now bore small calluses and paint stains like badges of honor. "Tighter on that corner joint," Terry instructed, his hands covering hers on the clamp. "Feel how it wants to sit?" Joanne nodded, concentrating on the sensation of wood finding its proper place. When the joint locked perfectly, she looked up to find Terry watching her with something that made her chest warm. "I did that," she said, unable to hide her pride. "You did that," he confirmed, and the approval in his voice was nothing like Richard's conditional praise. By afternoon, they'd installed the new light fixtures and were painting the final coat on the kitchen walls. Joanne stood back to admire their work. The space transformed from sterile perfection into something alive, functional, honest. "My family thinks I'm having a breakdown," she said, dipping her brush in the warm yellow paint they'd chosen together. "They can't understand why I'd rather live in construction dust than marble silence." Terry looked up from the trim he was cutting. "What do you think?" "I think this is the first time I've built something instead of just maintaining someone else's. A vision." She gestured around the kitchen where every decision had been theirs to make. "Everything here exists because we chose it together." The admission hung between them in the afternoon light streaming through windows that no longer carried secrets. Terry set down his brush, giving her his full attention. "Joanne," he said quietly, "what we're building here, it's not just about the house anymore, is it?" She met his eyes across their shared project, sawdust in her hair, paint on her cheek, looking more beautiful than she ever had in designer dresses. "No," she said simply, "it's about us." Terry crossed to where she stood, thumb brushing the yellow paint from her face. "Are you sure? Because once we start this foundation, there's no going back to the way things were." Joanne leaned into his touch, decision crystallizing, like everything finally falling into place. "I'm sure," she whispered. "Help me build something that lasts." Victoria arrived unannounced on a Saturday morning, pulling into the driveway just as Joanne and Terry were installing the final cabinet hardware. Through the window, Joanne watched her sister emerge from her silver BMW, wearing the kind of tailored suit that announced she'd come for serious business. "Company," Terry said quietly, following her gaze. Joanne wiped her hands on a dish towel, looking around the transformed kitchen. Warm yellow walls, handmade breakfast bar, windows that let in actual light. It looked nothing like the sterile showcase Richard had demanded. It looked like a place where people lived, laughed, maybe even argued safely. "Good," she said, surprising herself with her steadiness. "It's time." Victoria stepped through the front door and stopped short, taking in the changes. Gone were the perfectly positioned magazines and museum-quality flowers. In their place, tools organized in a corner, work gloves draped over a chair, a coffee mug Terry had left on the kitchen island next to blueprints for their next project. "Joanne," Victoria's voice carried careful neutrality. "The house looks different." "It looks lived in," Joanne replied, not moving to apologize for the honest mess of renovation. Terry appeared from the kitchen, nodding politely. "Ma'am, I'm Terry Williams." Victoria's assessment was swift and thorough. Work clothes, calloused hands, the easy way he stood in what she clearly still considered Richard's domain. "The contractor." "The partner," Joanne corrected firmly. The correction hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's eyes swept over the kitchen island, where Joanne and Terry's coffee mugs sat side by side, at the blueprints marked with both their handwriting, at the obvious intimacy of shared work. "Mother's worried," Victoria said finally. "She thinks you're making emotional decisions that you'll regret." "I regret 3 years of being afraid to touch anything in my own house," Joanne replied. "I regret learning to apologize for existing. I regret thinking that being safe meant being small." Victoria walked to the kitchen window, the same one that had been shattered weeks ago. Now it let in clear morning light, no spider web cracks, no evidence of violence. And this is better? Joanne looked around the space she and Terry had built together, every surface bearing evidence of choices made freely, work done with joy, instead of fear. Yes, this is honest. Honest doesn't pay the bills, Victoria said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. Terry stepped forward. Actually, Ma'am, Joanne and I are starting a renovation business. She's got a real eye for design, and she's learned to handle every tool in that workshop. Victoria stared at her sister, hair in a practical ponytail, hands stained with wood finish, standing beside a man who looked at her like she was capable of anything. "You're really doing this," Victoria said quietly. "I'm really living," Joanne replied. Finally, 6 months later, the house no longer echoed with emptiness. Joanne found Terry in the kitchen at sunset, reading over blueprints spread across the granite island, plans for the Victorian restoration project they'd won across town, Williams and Moreau home renovations. Her name looked right next to his, in bold letters on their business cards. "Mrs. Chen called," Joanne said, settling beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "She wants us to look at her master bathroom next week." Terry smiled, pencil tucked behind his ear. "That's the 4th referral from the Patterson job." Joanne traced the blueprint with her finger, still amazed that she could read the lines now, understand what they meant. She'd earned her contractor's license, learned to estimate materials, handle client consultations. Her hands were permanently stained with wood stain and paint, and she'd never been prouder of anything. "Remember when you said windows don't lie?" she asked. "Yeah, you were right about everything being connected, about damage showing up eventually." She looked around the kitchen they'd rebuilt together, warm, honest, alive, with the evidence of shared work. "But you didn't tell me that fixing one thing could fix everything else." Terry set down his pencil, gave her his full attention. The late afternoon light caught the gold in his brown eyes, the same eyes that had seen through her expensive facade to something worth saving. "Your mother called earlier," he said carefully. Joanne tensed slightly. "How did that go?" "She asked if we needed help with the Chen estimate." Terry's mouth curved into a smile. "Said she knows about tile work from all those years managing household renovations for other families." Joanne laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "She's coming around." Slowly. Terry reached for her hand, fingers intertwining naturally. "Victoria, too. She referred the Morrison account to us last week." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade outside. The house felt different now, lived in, loved, honest. No perfect surfaces hiding fundamental problems, no designer facade masking rotting foundations. "You know what I was thinking." "About today," Joanne said. "What?" "That first afternoon when you said I was the one falling apart." She leaned against his shoulder. "I thought you were being cruel." "I was being honest." "Same thing sometimes." She tilted her head to look at him. "But falling apart wasn't the problem. Staying broken was." Terry's arm tightened around her. "Good thing we're both pretty good at renovations." Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting warm pools of light across the neighborhood. In the kitchen, surrounded by the tools of their trade and the evidence of their choices, Joanne and Terry sat planning their next project. The house was solid now, the foundation secure. And sometimes, Joanne thought, watching Terry sketch modifications. To Mrs. Chen's bathroom design, the most beautiful renovations are the ones that teach you how to rebuild yourself.